My name is Elena Walsh. I used to think that love came with terms unspoken, but binding, work hard, don't speak out of turn, be helpful, quiet, and easy to forget, and above all, never ask for too much. That was how I lived most of my life. Especially in the house I grew up in, my father didn't tolerate weakness, and in his eyes, I suppose that's what I was. Not weak in the way that meant fragile or soft, but weak in the way that meant not shining enough to matter. My sister Ava was everything he ever wanted, bold, beautiful. Always at the center of every room, she laughed louder, dressed sharper, and knew how to make men like our father feel important. She studied finance because he did. She wore ambition like it was perfume, and when she walked into a room, she always turned heads, his included. At every dinner, every holiday, every birthday, I watched her bask in the warmth of his attention while I passed the salad and cleared the plates. I was never resentful, not at first. I thought it was just a matter of time, that if I worked hard, stayed out of the way, and made no mistakes, eventually he would see me, not just look at me, but see me. I kept my voice soft, my opinions tucked away, and my accomplishments quiet. I thought that if I stayed the course, he would one day place a hand on my shoulder and say something simple like, "I'm proud of you." I would have settled for that, truly. Instead, what I got was silence, or worse, the occasional glance, followed by a sigh, as though my very existence was another bill he hadn't planned on paying. When I got accepted into my university's nonprofit leadership program, he barely looked up from his paper. When I graduated with honors, he said nothing at all. But when Ava got a job at his friend's firm, some glossy, superficial position that came with a title and no real work, he threw a dinner party, and I showed up. I always did. I bought a new dress, straightened my hair, smiled at the jokes I didn't find funny. I listened to stories about golf trips and quarterly earnings. I sat beside my mother, who nodded dutifully at everything my father said. Her wine glass never empty, but her voice rarely used. She was a master at pretending, and I guess in some ways, so was I. But I was building something they didn't see. Something small at first, born out of long nights and second-hand furniture in an apartment with peeling paint and flickering lights. I started my nonprofit with little more than stubbornness and an Excel sheet. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with praise, but it mattered. We helped people who slipped through the cracks, veterans, single parents, the elderly who couldn't afford groceries. We didn't just give handouts, we built bridges, and I loved it. Even if no one in my family cared enough to ask what I was doing, sometimes I'd imagine telling them about it. I'd picture my father's expression softening, his shoulders relaxing as I explained how our work had quietly improved lives. I'd see Ava surprised, maybe even impressed, but those were fantasies. I knew the truth in our house. If you didn't bring home 6 figures or a title that made people nod with recognition, you were just noise in the background. So I stayed quiet. I grew my organization in silence. I filled out grant applications on the train, took meetings during lunch breaks, slept for hours a night, and still showed up early the next morning. I learned how to write press releases, organize fundraisers, and stretch every donated dollar, until it became a lifeline for someone else. I built a team. I mentored interns. I didn't post it on social media. I didn't shout it from rooftops. I just did the work. I told myself that one day, maybe someone at that table would ask me how I'd been, what I'd been building, who I was becoming, but they never did, and I thought I could live with that. I thought I could carry their silence like armor, that I didn't need them to see me as long as I saw myself. Until the night my father slammed his fork down in front of everyone and told me I was a burden. That was the night everything I believed about family shattered, not because I hadn't seen it coming, but because deep down, I still hoped I was wrong. There's a particular kind of silence that comes from being overlooked so often. It starts to feel like routine. Not painful exactly, just expected. It lives in the pauses between questions no one asks you. It curls up beside you at crowded tables where everyone talks over you. It lingers in the way people say your name last, if at all. I'd grown used to that kind of silence, the way some people get used to cold winters or lukewarm coffee. You stop flinching, but it doesn't mean you don't feel it. Growing up, I learned how to disappear in plain sight. I could be in a room without ever really being in it. My father would hold court at the head of the dinner table, talking stocks and strategy, always pausing to ask Ava what she thought of a recent market trend or if she had reached out to So-and-so at the firm. I, on the other hand, passed the peas, refilled glasses, laughed when it felt appropriate, never too loud, never too long. I knew my place, and for a while, I thought there was nobility in that. My mother didn't encourage me to fight for attention. She had long since mastered the art of fading into the wallpaper. She wore pearls, always, even on the days she didn't leave the house. Her hair was always perfect, her tone always agreeable. She never challenged my father's voice. Just softened the edges of his moods with perfect posture and pleasant small talk. I watched her often. She loved us in quiet ways, cut fruit on school mornings, warm socks fresh from the dryer, but she rarely spoke of dreams or regrets. Maybe because she'd learned there was no room for both. Ava, by contrast, was bold in all the ways I wasn't. She didn't need to ask for attention, it followed her. She lit up rooms, people remembered her laugh. She wore ambition proudly and unapologetically, and my father ate it up like a second helping of dessert. She could say the same thing I had just said and somehow it would sound smarter, more valid. I wasn't jealous of her, not really. I just didn't understand how we were raised in the same house and taught such different lessons about value. Once I brought home a certificate from a regional leadership program I'd been selected for. It had been a tough selection process, and I had worked hard to get in. I placed it on the kitchen counter, next to Ava's framed job offer letter from a hedge fund. My father glanced at it on his way out the door, barely slowing his stride, and muttered, "That's nice, Elena," before slamming the door behind him. Ava's letter had earned a champagne toast. It wasn't the lack of praise that hurt, it was the assumption that I hadn't earned one. Over time, I stopped bringing things home. What was the point of sharing if no one was listening? I stopped offering updates at family dinners, stopped correcting them when they assumed I still worked part-time at a temp agency. It was easier to smile and nod than to explain why my work didn't come with glossy titles or designer suits. I focused instead on building what I could control: my nonprofit, my team, my community. I gave everything to it because I knew what it felt like to be forgotten. I built something that paid attention to the people no one else saw. Still, part of me hoped quietly, shamefully, that one day they would see me too. That I'd walk into a room and my father would ask, not out of politeness but curiosity, "What have you been working on?" That my mother would place a hand over mine and say she was proud. That Ava would look at me not as the tag-along little sister, but as a peer, an equal. But hope, when it isn't fed, turns sour, and the longer I waited, the more I realized that in our family, you weren't someone until you had something to show. Not compassion, not kindness, not quite achievements, but something with numbers, headlines, recognition. I didn't have any of that yet, not then, but I was close, closer than they ever imagined. And one day, I would bring it all to the table, not for applause, not for permission, but because I deserved to be there, even if I had to pull out my own chair. They say success is loud, but mine lived in silence for a long time. It lived in dimly lit cafes where I typed until my fingers cramped, in grant portals that crashed at midnight, in voicemail inboxes of community leaders who never called back. It lived in the broken copy machines I fixed myself, the fundraising calls I made during lunch breaks, the closets I turned into offices, and the nights I fell asleep with blue light still glowing on my face. My success wasn't glamorous. It didn't post selfies or wear heels. It wore under-eye circles and thrift store blazers, but it worked. The nonprofit began as a seed of an idea. What if someone created a space for the people always talk it over, the ones asked to be grateful for scraps? I'd met too many people who were slipping through cracks that no one even admitted were there. Low-income families who didn't qualify for aid by a few dollars. College students choosing between books and food. Veterans denied basic services because they missed a form or a deadline. I couldn't save everyone, but I could make a dent. So I wrote a mission statement in a spiral notebook and filed the incorporation papers by candlelight. After a power outage, I used what little I had: an old laptop, a folding table, my own rent money. There were days I didn't eat properly, didn't sleep more than 3 hours, but I kept moving. I worked 2 part-time jobs, did freelance editing at night, and still showed up to weekend food drives with a clipboard and a tired smile. People started noticing, not the kind of people my father would care about, but people who mattered to me, people who said thank you and meant it. 2 years in, we won our first grant, $10,000 from a state initiative. I cried in the bathroom stall at the community center where I had just scrubbed a coffee stain out of the carpet. Then I went back to work. We used that grant to launch a mobile pantry program that delivered groceries and hygiene products to people without transportation. I watched grown men cry as they loaded diapers into the trunks of rusted-out cars. I watched teenagers line up for tampons and shampoo because their schools didn't have enough supplies. I didn't tell my family about any of it, not because I was ashamed, but because I already knew what their faces would look like. My father would raise a brow and ask how long I thought that kind of thing could last. My sister would fake a smile and ask if I'd considered turning it into a consulting firm. My mother would nod, as if that was enough, and then turn the conversation back to Ava's promotion. So, I kept it for myself. Eventually, the nonprofit grew into something real. We partnered with local businesses, applied for more grants, got accepted into a national coalition. Our programs expanded. I built a staff, trained volunteers, learned how to write budgets that made numbers speak with empathy. We launched a social impact initiative that happened ironically to include several PR partnerships with corporations. One of them was my father's. He never knew. He delegated it to a junior marketing rep who signed the agreement. Grateful for the tax breaks and local goodwill, my foundation helped his company survive a rough economic quarter with charity partnerships and social responsibility metrics he later bragged about at conferences. All the while, I sat at my kitchen table, matching fonts on brochures he never bothered to read. And still, I said nothing, because I didn't want credit. I didn't need a gold star or a newspaper spread. I just wanted to help people who'd been told they weren't worth saving. I wanted to be the person I once needed, but deep inside, a small ember stayed lit. Not from bitterness, but from knowing that one day I would sit at a table again, one where I wasn't expected to shrink, to stay quiet, to stay small. And when I finally spoke, they wouldn't be able to look away. Not because I'd raised my voice, but because I'd built something louder than their silence ever was. It was Ava's promotion dinner, another celebration, another carefully curated evening where I was both invited and invisible. The restaurant was one of those dimly lit, overpriced places my father favored: leather booths, flickering candles, staff trained to treat your credit card like royalty. Everyone was already halfway through cocktails when I arrived. I was on time, but the story of my life had always been arriving before anyone noticed. My father sat at the head of the table, a position he had claimed both physically and emotionally since I was a child. Ava, radiant as always, sat next to him, beaming with the practiced confidence of someone who knew they were adored. My mother was already halfway into her second glass of Chardonnay, smiling in that polite, weary way she had perfected over the years. The other seats were filled with extended family, a few of Ava's friends from work, and one man I didn't recognize but who seemed to know everyone else. I found my spot at the far end, 2 chairs down from my mother, close enough to hear the conversation but not close enough to be included in it. I told myself I didn't mind, that I was used to it, that I was there to support my sister, not to be seen. But the truth is, I had dressed carefully that night. I had straightened my hair, worn the earrings my mentor gave me when our nonprofit hit its 5th anniversary. I had chosen a deep blue dress that made me feel calm and steady. I had hoped just a little that someone would notice. They didn't. Dinner began, and so did the small talk. My father dominated the conversation, as usual, making jokes that drew polite laughter and commentary that people nodded at, even when it made no sense. He bragged about Ava's promotion like it had been a family achievement, like he'd raised her to be a corporate star, and here was the proof. No one mentioned my name. No one asked what I'd been working on. I kept quiet, as always, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew they wouldn't hear it. Halfway through the meal, I reached for a second helping of risotto. My hand barely grazed the serving spoon when my father's fork hit the table with a sharp, echoing thud. The sound sliced through the conversation, through the clinking of glasses and murmurs of laughter, until the room fell silent. My hand froze mid-air. He didn't raise his voice immediately. He leaned forward, his eyes narrow, and said, with all the force of a blade, "You're a burden to this family. Elena, you bring nothing but disappointment. Just go." My chest constricted. For a second, I couldn't breathe. No one moved. My mother stared into her plate like the words hadn't been spoken. Ava didn't even pretend to be shocked. She just sipped her wine and glanced at me over the rim of her glass. The corner of her mouth curled ever so slightly. I don't remember how long I sat there, But I do remember the sound of my own heartbeat, loud, defiant, and then quiet again, steadying itself. I thought I might cry, that my hands would shake, that I'd run to the bathroom and lock myself inside like I had once done when I was 13 and he told me I was too sensitive to ever survive the real world. But I didn't cry. I picked up my purse, and for the first time in years, I was ready to speak, not from a place of desperation but from knowing, the kind of knowing that grows roots in silence, the kind of knowing that is unshakable. I stood up, and the room braced for embarrassment. They expected an apology or an exit, but I wasn't leaving with shame. I had come prepared for the moment they pushed me too far, and they had just given me the floor. There's a sound that comes right after public humiliation. It isn't loud. It's not a gasp or a sob or even a breath. It's a pause, a collective holding of breath, a tightening of silence so sharp you could almost hear it snap. That's what filled the room after my father told me to leave, that I was a burden, that I brought nothing but disappointment. Everyone around the table froze. Even the waiter who had been pouring wine one table over looked up. And in that breathless silence, I stood. I didn't feel strong in that moment. I didn't feel powerful or poised. I felt like a girl with scraped knees standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified and tired of pretending the fall wouldn't hurt. My heart was pounding. I could feel the flush rise in my face, the sting behind my eyes, but I didn't blink. I reached slowly into my purse and pulled out a folder I had carried with me for months, more out of habit than planning. It held the original nonprofit incorporation papers, the first federal grant award, and a one-sheet summary of our impact data for the year. I laid the folder flat on the table in front of my father. He looked at it like it was an inconvenience, something I had interrupted him with. His eyes skimmed the cover page, unimpressed. He didn't lift his hand to open it. He just said, "What is this?" "My life's work," I replied, my voice low but steady. "The nonprofit I founded. The organization that's helped over 12,000 families in the last 5 years. The one that's been quietly supporting local businesses, including yours, with community outreach, charity partnerships, and PR grants." I paused, watching him process. "Your company was featured last year in our corporate social responsibility showcase. You received tax credits for it. You even spoke at an event we organized." The blood drained from his face, not dramatically, just enough for me to see the shift. Ava leaned forward slightly, her mouth parted in confusion. My mother didn't move at all. "I've done all of it without your money, without your help, and without your permission," I said. "You call me a burden, but your company survived the last recession in part because of the burden you tried to erase." He still didn't speak. For the first time in my life, my father didn't have a word to say. I turned to the others around the table, relatives who had nodded along to his judgment, friends who had always believed Ava was the only success story in the family. I let the silence settle over them, let them sit with the discomfort. No one reached for a drink. No one changed the subject. There was nothing to say. The power wasn't in what I handed him. It wasn't in the numbers or the paperwork. It was in the audacity of it, that I had dared to build something without their gaze. And now they had to look at it. They had to look at me. For years, I had swallowed my accomplishments like secrets. I had waited for someone to ask, waited for a moment to be seen, but standing there in that dining room, I realized something with such clarity it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I had already become everything they never imagined I could be, and they hadn't even noticed. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't wait for my father to apologize or for Ava to finally offer something resembling respect. I knew better. I reached for my purse, tucked the folder back inside, and stepped away from the table. My mother looked up at me, then her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but she didn't. As I turned toward the door, my legs felt steady, my heart still beat fast, but it no longer hurt. That night, I left the table not as the daughter they ignored, but as the woman they could no longer dismiss. And I walked out knowing I was never coming back, not as who they thought I was. When I stepped out of that restaurant, the night air wrapped around me like a blanket I hadn't known I needed. It was cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of that dining room, where every chair had felt like a stage and every glance like a judgment. I stood outside for a few minutes, unsure of where to go, not because I had nowhere to be, but because I had never walked away from them like that before. I had always stayed, always swallowed whatever bitterness was served, always smiled through the sting. But not this time. My heels clicked against the sidewalk as I walked away, the city lights reflecting off the windows of passing cars. The sound of laughter from inside the restaurant fading with every step. I didn't call anyone, I didn't cry, I didn't need to. When I got home, I sat at my desk and pulled out the folder again. The papers were slightly creased now, smudged in places from the warmth of my hands, but still intact like me. I smoothed each page out, one by one, like laying bricks for something I was still building. I reread the language of the articles of incorporation, the federal grant notice with the official seal, the letters of endorsement from local leaders, who had seen the difference we were making. I had filed those papers 2 years ago, tucked them away quietly in a drawer, and kept building without fanfare. I had told myself it wasn't about recognition, that the work mattered more than the applause, and that was still true. But what I realized in that moment, what had hit me like a slow rising tide, was that recognition wasn't the same as validation. I didn't need their permission, but I had spent years waiting for their eyes, waiting for someone in my family to notice the weight I carried, the good I had done, the people I had helped. I thought maybe if they knew, they'd stop looking through me. But they didn't know, not because I hid it poorly, but because they never thought to ask. I had been sitting at that table with a world they refused to see, and now, even when I laid it in front of them, they still couldn't recognize what they were looking at. That was their failure, not mine. The nonprofit wasn't just a passion project anymore. It had grown into a living, breathing entity that had lifted real lives. Our social impact reports had been used into congressional briefings. We had a staff of 12. We had built emergency housing partnerships during the pandemic. My father's company had partnered with us for optics, something I'd allowed strategically. Not out of desperation, I had leveraged their name recognition to help others, even when they hadn't acknowledged me at all. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who dismissed me as a disappointment had unknowingly benefited from my work, and he would never have known if I hadn't said it out loud, if I hadn't finally looked him in the eye and told him the truth. I sat there for hours that night, flipping through those documents, each one a chapter of a story I had written without their ink. I remembered the nights I'd stayed awake, writing grant applications while others slept, the days I skipped meals to keep the lights on in our office space, the way I had held the hands of strangers and listened to stories that broke my heart over and over again and kept going. And yet, when he looked at me, all he saw was someone unremarkable, a burden. But I wasn't the one who had failed to see value. He was, and that's when I knew the folder wasn't for them anymore. It never had been. I had been carrying it like a shield, like proof that I mattered. But I didn't need proof. I had impact, I had integrity. I had built something from scratch, in silence, with no handouts and no applause. That was enough. That would always be enough. I put the papers away that night, not out of shame, but with reverence. Not because I was hiding them again, but because they no longer needed to be seen to be real. I had already shown the world who I was. It was time they learned to look harder. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my family was expected. But it still hurt. There were no phone calls, no text messages, no carefully worded apologies, not even a passive-aggressive email from my mother. The kind that pretended nothing had happened while managing to blame me all the same. My father, of course, said nothing. I imagined him sitting in his office, rationalizing what he said, minimizing it in his head, convincing himself that I had overreacted, that I had embarrassed him, that somehow his outburst had been justified. But I had no interest in justifying anything anymore. What I did care about was the impact, the truth slowly seeping into the cracks of the lie they had lived so comfortably in. The illusion of my insignificance had always been a convenient story for them. It made it easier to dismiss me, to prop up Ava as the golden child without having to reckon with my presence. But now the truth was out in the open, in their hands, in the form of paperwork that carried weight, tangible, irrefutable evidence that I had become something they never expected. And more than that, something they depended on. Even if they didn't know it, word spread, not because I made it happen, but because the work I'd been doing had finally caught the attention of people who knew how to lift voices, not silence them. A local news outlet ran a feature on our mobile outreach program, highlighting our partnerships with corporate sponsors including, by name, my father's company. I hadn't planted the story, it was part of a broader initiative we were part of. And I hadn't even realized we'd be included in the final piece until someone from our communications team sent me the link. In K. There it was in black and white, the name of the foundation I had built, alongside his firm's logo, credited as one of the community partners that had helped sustain vulnerable families during the worst of the recession. The photo accompanying the article showed me at one of our weekend distribution sites, handing out care packages to a young mother holding her son. I didn't look glamorous, my hair was pulled back, my jeans were worn, but I looked real, present, grounded, and for the first time, I didn't care how I looked. I only cared that we were finally being seen. Ava texted me 2 days later. It was short. Wow, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? I stared at my phone for a long time before deciding not to respond. There was no point in explaining something to someone who had never asked until now. She wasn't reaching out to understand, she was reaching out because the image she'd been comfortable with had cracked. And she needed help piecing it back together. Let her sit with it. Let them all sit with it, because this wasn't about spite. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to see them fall. I only needed them to really know that I had never been a failure, that I had been building something all along. That their absence didn't break me, it revealed me. I didn't walk into boardrooms asking to be seen anymore. I was requested. I didn't send emails hoping for partnerships. I turned people away when their values didn't align. I didn't beg for attention or praise. I gave talks. I mentored. I made decisions that affected real change, and not once did I do it for them. But now, they had no choice but to see me, not because I raised my voice or made a scene, but because the foundation I had built had risen high, enough to cast a shadow on the table they had once pushed me away from. I had never been a burden. I had always been the builder, and they, every last one of them, had simply never bothered to look up. They didn't speak to me for a while after. The story ran. No surprise there, my father was the type of man who would rather rewrite history than admit he was wrong. In his world, silence was strength, apologies were weakness, and daughters like me, quiet, steady, and outside his line of vision, were only relevant when they were useful. That night at the dinner table had shattered the version of me he was comfortable keeping, and instead of asking himself why he hadn't seen what I'd built, he likely spent those weeks convincing himself it didn't matter. But silence can only hold so much. Eventually, it cracks. The first sign came from my mother, a forwarded email, no subject line, just a single line of text. Your father saw the article. Attached was a screenshot of the news piece, with my photo circled like evidence in a case she was too afraid to testify in. I stared at it for a while, waiting to feel something, relief, maybe a flicker of reconciliation, but I didn't. All I felt was tired. Tired of being acknowledged only when forced, tired of the dance around emotion, tired of people only reaching out when the narrative no longer served them. I didn't respond. Ava tried again a week later, another text, longer. This time, I really didn't know the extent of what you were doing. It's impressive, I hope we can talk. She was always careful, always diplomatic. She'd learned to navigate our family like a PR campaign, managing appearances, knowing what to say and when. But I wasn't interested in curated reconnection. I wanted the kind of love that didn't have to be earned in press clippings or grant reports, and that love, it had never been at that table. So I said nothing. Instead, I poured myself back into my work. There were new grant cycles coming, a city proposal to submit, and a gala to plan. For the end of the year, I spoke at a conference for women in leadership and shared my story, not the part about my family, but the part about building something from scratch, about redefining success on your own terms. Afterward, a young woman came up to me, tears in her eyes, and said, "You made me feel like I'm not crazy for wanting more." That was the validation I didn't know I needed. Not a nod from a man who had spent my entire life belittling what he didn't understand. Not a text from a sister who couldn't be bothered to see me until the world did. But that girl, standing in front of me, saying she saw herself in me, that mattered. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped needing their approval. I had stopped wishing they would come around. I had stopped measuring myself against their definitions of worth, and I had started measuring myself against my own. I wasn't angry anymore, not the way I used to be. I didn't fantasize about confrontations or crafting the perfect response. I had moved beyond the version of me that needed them to say they were proud. That version of me had lived for the possibility of a seat at their table, but the woman I had become, She built her own, and at that table, there was room for voices like mine. For those who had been overlooked, dismissed, told to sit down and be quiet until they had something to show. I had something now, not just a folder of papers. Not just a successful nonprofit, but a life I had designed with integrity, with compassion, with clarity. A life that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with finally standing in the truth of who I was. There's a shift that happens when you stop waiting to be chosen, when you realize that worth isn't something another person gives you, but something you learn to hold for yourself. That's where I lived now, in that shift. In that space of quiet certainty, not loud, not showy, just rooted. The nonprofit continued to grow in ways I could have never predicted. Our annual report showed we had served over 20,000 individuals in the past year, alone, through food programs, emergency housing, educational support, and health advocacy. We launched a pilot mentorship initiative for girls in underserved neighborhoods. We helped a single mother avoid eviction. We got a wheelchair ramp installed for a veteran who had been crawling into his home for years. These were the stories no one at my family's table had ever asked about, but these were the stories I had chosen to live by. We also secured a 7-figure grant through a national foundation, our largest yet. The funds would allow us to open a second office and expand statewide. When I received the award letter, I sat on my couch, barefoot in sweatpants, and cried, not because of the money, but because I remembered where it all began: a tiny desk, a flickering lamp, a stack of rejection letters, and a girl who wasn't sure if she mattered. Now I had proof that I did. Not just in headlines or numbers, but in the faces of the people we served, in the volunteers who said I made them feel like their time had meaning, in the handwritten notes from families who said we made them feel seen. Those were the metrics I cared about. That was my return on investment, but still, the world kept surprising me. After the grant was announced, we were offered a short feature in a national magazine spotlight series on women leading change. They sent a photographer. I wore a simple black blouse and stood in front of our office building with my hands folded, feeling both small and monumental. When the piece came out, it was titled, "The Quiet Builder." Ava forwarded the article to our extended family group chat. I wasn't in it anymore, hadn't been since I walked away from that dinner, but someone sent me a screenshot. Her caption read, "So proud of my sister." I stared at that message for a long time. It didn't make me smile. It didn't make me angry. It just felt late, like a compliment thrown at a statue after the artist had already left the room, like praise that arrived years after the bruise had faded. My mother emailed soon after. A short note, no punctuation, just her way. I read the piece. "I didn't know. I'm sorry if we made you feel small." I didn't reply, not because I held a grudge, but because I'd spent too long trying to decode their affection. Too long hoping that one day it would feel warm instead of sharp-edged. I didn't need that anymore. Instead, I poured that energy into the lives around me, the ones who needed it. I mentored a teenage girl who reminded me too much of myself. I stood by her as she gave a speech at her school's first social justice assembly. I watched her find her voice, and something inside me healed, just watching her stand where I once sat, invisible. The world has a way of circling back, not to hurt you, but to remind you of how far you've come. I used to think the measure of success was being invited to stay, but now I knew the real power came from knowing you could leave, and that when you did, you didn't leave empty-handed. You carried everything they never saw in you, and you turned it into something they couldn't ignore. I had never been the burden. I had been the foundation. They just never looked down far enough to see it. I pass by the house sometimes, not out of nostalgia, not to punish myself, but to remind myself of where the story started. It's still there, to stories: red brick, white shutters, a porch swing that creaks in the wind. The lawn is manicured, the driveway clean from the outside. Nothing has changed, but I know better. That house may have stayed the same, but I am not the girl who once cried in her bedroom, wondering why her voice wasn't enough to be heard. After the grant and the magazine feature, things moved fast. We were approached by a tech-backed philanthropy firm interested in acquiring the infrastructure of our programs and offering resources to scale. It wasn't just a buyout, it was a partnership, one that would give us reach far beyond the city. I kept our core mission. I kept our staff, but for the first time, I had something else too: wealth. It was quiet at first, the kind of money that didn't scream, but it changed things. I bought our office space outright. I funded scholarships. I stopped thinking in terms of if we can afford it and started asking how do we do it best. And yes, eventually I bought property, including the house my father once sold after downsizing his business in the wake of the recession, the one my nonprofit helped him weather without his knowledge. I bought it under an LLC. He never knew. It's a rental now, a peaceful one, where a young couple with 2 children's lives. They added flower boxes under the windows and painted the porch swing a soft blue. The kids leave sidewalk chalk drawings on the walkway. When I drive by, I slow down not to reclaim anything, but to acknowledge it. That house is no longer a place of exile. It's not a symbol of shame. It's just a building. What once broke me now pays me. I haven't seen my father since that dinner. I don't need to. I've learned that closure doesn't always come in words or tears or apologies. Sometimes it comes in the form of absence, of not needing anything more. My mother sends updates occasionally, usually small and vague. Ava reached out again, asking if we could grab coffee sometime. But I haven't responded. Maybe one day I will. Maybe I won't. The difference now is that I get to decide. And that is the quiet revolution, having a choice. Not long ago, I stood on a stage and gave a keynote speech to a packed auditorium. I talked about resilience, about the invisible labor of women, about what it means to build without permission. I didn't mention my father. I didn't have to. My story stood on its own. Afterward, a woman approached me, maybe in her 60s, and said, "You're everything I tried to become when I was younger but didn't know how." I held her hand for a moment. I understood that night. I went home and sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, overlooking the city I once thought would swallow me whole. And I smiled, not because I'd proven them wrong, but because I'd finally proven something to myself. I was never the girl they labeled, never the afterthought, never the failure. I was the woman who walked away with nothing but her name and her fire, and built a life so full, so rich with meaning, that even the people who tried to forget her could no longer afford to. Not until I had something to show. No, I had it all along. They just didn't know where to look.